number 12 of our course Sociolinguistics. Today we are going to continue our study in chapter number 9, where we talk about language and the construction of a group identities. We will discuss topics like identity and representation, in-groups and outer-groups, linguistic variation and the construction of identity, where we consider also stylistic variation and language choice. Then we move to our study of power and linguistic imperialism. This will bring us to the end of chapter 9, where we move to the second chapter, the standard English debate, where we are going to consider only the first point, which is what is standard English. So as a start, today we talk about language and the construction of a group identity. We start with a definition of the word representation. We have already talked about this in previous lectures, where we have defined what the word representation. This is another similar definition. Representation is how the speaker chooses to refer to something or to someone by categorizing them as belonging to a social group. So the way that you choose to categorize, to classify somebody or someone or something as belonging to a social group, to a particular social group, is what we call representation. So it refers to the way that we choose to classify things or to classify people or categorize them as belonging to a specific group. Identity and representation. We need to understand the relation between identity and representation. Imposing labels of identity. To understand this, we have a quotation by an author called Sack in 1995. He says, if a kid is driving, he is seen as a teenager. So notice, this is a kid and he's driving a car, but people will look at him as a teenager. So what happened is that they are imposing labels of identity to this person. His problem then initially is that he is in fact going to be typed. So they type him, they classify him, they categorize him, where for one, the category teenager is a category owned by adults. So to understand this, we have a child driving a car and people will look at him as a teenager, but any teenager is controlled by an adult. So this also shows us how imposing a label of identity can be very effective to people. So according to Sack, identity and representation, we have several points. Labels of identity are imposed by people who may be in a more powerful position. So not anybody can come and start imposing those labels of identity. The person who has the right, or the person who can impose labels of identity on any other person, should be higher in status, should have a high powerful position. Number two, people who impose labels of identity may use the labels to make a kind of social judgment. So if they look at you and they say, this is a child or this is a teenager, in fact they have judged you. This is a social judgment where they use this label, this is a child, this is a girl, this is an adult. By this label, they in fact are using those labels to judge you. They are giving some social judgment on the person they impose the labels on. Number three, we do not always control the category that people use to define our identity. So if you are, for example, driving a car, anybody else can impose labels of identity on you. In fact, we do not have to control people who impose labels of identity. They are beyond our reach. We cannot control who impose labels of identity on us. So because this can happen by people of a high status, can happen by our boss, by our colleague, by any other person. Number 4, we do not always control the cultural assumption that accompany labels of identity. Some labels of identity have some cultural assumption. Let's take an example. If you think of a person from the Gulf, the first assumption that comes to our mind that this person has come from a rich country where there is a lot of oil and people are investing in oil. But this is a cultural assumption. This cannot always be true. So we do not always control the cultural assumption, because people have this previously in their minds and they judge us according to those cultural assumptions, and they impose labels of identity into us by their cultural assumptions. We move next to in-group and out-group, and we start with explaining what those two terms means. Determining one's social identity. Number 1, determining one's social identity is not purely an individual matter. You cannot say, okay, I want to determine my social identity. I am an individual, I have the right to do this, but this is not always true. Determining one's social identity is not purely an individual matter, because you are living within a society, you are communicating with other people who can always give you certain judgment, whether they are social judgment, whether they can impose labels of identity on you or not. Number 2, determining one's social identity is also bound up with how others perceive us. So depending on how people think of us, they start to give us or to determine our social identity, because the way people think is different from the way that we think. So people have different way of thinking, and therefore they will judge us, or they give us certain social judgment depending on the way they think. So determining our social identity can to a large extent depend on the how others perceive us, the way they think of us. Number 4, our perception of ourselves also can be related to others. Our perception of ourselves can also be in relation to our status within a social group. So number 1, our relation with others, and number 2, our relation in relation to our status within a social group. Number D, our status within a social group can be constructed through language use. This is the point that we need to understand, that our status, our position within a social group can be constructed, can be created, can be established through what? Through our use of language. The way that we speak, the way that we use language can determine our social identity within a specific community, within a specific group or a social group. We need to understand what does the term in-group and out-group means. In-group is a social group to which the speaker belongs. We understand this if we compare it to the other term, which is out-group. The out-group comprises people who do not belong to that group. So in the in-group, we talk about a social group to which we belong. We have a sense of belonging to this group. But the outer group is quite the opposite. It comprises people who do not belong to that group. Let's have an example. If we have a gang member who may use certain expressions with each other that mark them as members of a particular gang or in-group. So if you have your own group of people, of friends, basically you are going to use specific terms, specific vocabulary that distinguishes this group from another. So it distinguishes you from a different group. So when you use certain expressions, when you use certain words, certain vocabulary with each other in that group, this will mark the member of that group, your friend, your colleague, of a particular gang or in-group. So we call it an in-group then. At the same time, the use of these expressions can differentiate them from members of other groups. So any member or any person who is not related to this group is called out group. the out group in that situation. So again, at the same time, the use of these expressions can differentiate them from members of other groups. So I need to repeat this again. In a group and outer group, if you belong to one group where all the members share certain features or certain characteristics, they use specific language, they use specific words, they are related to the in group. Any other person who does not belong to this group is called out group. Linguistic variation and the construction of identity. In this section, in fact, we discuss how people can shift between different styles of speaking. So sometimes we do not use one style of speaking, we change our style of speech. This contributes to the construction of a particular social identity. So when you change the way you talk with each other, with other people, this will also contribute to your social identity. How people are going to perceive you as a speaker, how they are going to perceive you as an individual. Again, this takes us back to the very important point that social group has to do with the way that we use language. How we speak, how we use the language determines the way people impose labels of identity or give us social judgment or classify us or categorize us as belonging to a certain or specific social group. So let's have a definition of what we mean by style shifting, and we discuss this within stylistic variation and language choice. What do we mean by style shifting? What do we mean by changing our style or using a different style from the one that we usually use? So people do not always, as I said, use the same style when they talk. In fact, they can shift their speech style, and this can involve using different words and different pronunciation and probably different grammar, different structure of sentences. So changing the style can mean changing the way we speak, changing some vocabulary, changing some grammar, and changing some pronunciation of specific words. Let's have an example. Those are examples showing you how one word changes from one style to another. Notice the style difference between singing and singing. Some people say, I am singing, without pronouncing the ing at the end. Singing. Others would say singing. Another example in the use of colors. People would usually use a green, but there are other styles in which people say verdant to mean green. There is also change in grammar. When some people says so I says, we know that this is grammatically not acceptable. So I says, but this is a style. Some people tend to use this style, and the other counterpart style is so I said or so I say, but not says. So this shows us the first example, singing and singing, is an example of pronunciation. The second example, verdant and green, is an example of vocabulary where people tend to change words, they use different words. And the third example is an example of a grammar where we have different structure of the of an utterance or of a sentence. So somebody can say so I says, and another person would say so I said. So this is a change of style. We know that I cannot come with an S with the third person singular, but it is a style. Some people tend to use this style. So this shows us how change of style can involve pronunciation, can involve vocabulary, and can involve also grammar. Stylistic variation and language choice, we still within this section. We also position ourselves in relation to others by the way that we talk in different kinds of interaction. So we also position ourselves. When we relate ourselves to the society, within our friend, within the people that we work with, so we are positioning ourselves in relation to others. We cannot be by our own. We have to position ourselves in relation to other people of the society by the way that we talk. So again, our use of language and different kind of instruction. This takes us to a definition of audience design. What's meant by audience design? It is very much related to changing style or to style shifting. Let's read the definition together, then we go back to the explanation. Audience design refers to the notion that speakers will take into account whom they are addressing and alter their speech style accordingly. Again, so audience design refers to the notion that speakers will take into account, will take into consideration, will bear in their minds whom they are addressing. Who is the person they are addressing? Are they addressing their friends? Are they addressing their manager? Are they addressing their colleagues? So they take in their mind, they pay attention that whom they are addressing is a different person, and therefore they change, they alter the speech style according to what they see, according to the person they talk to, or according to whether this person is a close friend or a manager, etc. So according to this definition, a person would change his style according to the situation in which he is in. So if he is talking to a manager, his style will change, or his way of speaking will alter. And if he's speaking to his brother, if he's speaking to his children, always he has to design certain way of talking so that it is suitable for the person he is addressing. The other definition is related to linguistic convergence. Linguistic convergence, and we will have an example which explains this in a better way. Linguistic convergence is a process in which speakers change their speech to make it more similar to that of their hearer. So again, it is a process in which speakers change their speech, they change the way they talk to make their speech similar to that of their hearer. So if you have a person who is speaking native language, or who is a native speaker of English, and he tries to speak standard English, and when he starts communicating with you, automatically you are converging your language and try to bring it similar to the level of standard English that he uses or she uses. So if, for example, somebody is using standard Arabic, and instead of using your own dialect, you also start to use standard English. In this way, you are bringing your language to his language. Your language becomes similar or close to his language. This is what's called language or linguistic convergence, where the two languages converge at one point so that speaker and hearer are on the same level, are on the same boat. So what happens is, it is a process in which the speakers change their speech to make it more similar to that of their hearer. Linguistic maintenance is quite the opposite. It is a process in which speakers may choose not to converge. So if somebody is using a Black English, or a language which is not a standard, but you usually speak standard English, if somebody speaks to you his own dialect or her own dialect, it is not always obligatory to bring your language down to his dialect. And in this way, if you keep using your standard and he keeps using his dialect, this is called linguistic convergence, where the two languages are converging from one another. They are not at the same level. One is dialect, one is standard, one is up, one is down. So this is called linguistic divergence, when the speaker and the hearer diverge from one another, from the language of one another. They do not bring their languages close to one another. They do not actually converge, diverge. So this is called linguistic maintenance. When you maintain your own dialect, you do not change, you do not alter your dialect to be similar to the language of the person who is speaking with you. This also brings us to the other definition, linguistic divergence, when the two languages are not actually brought together, they are not similar to one another. So linguistic divergence is a process in which speakers choose to move away from the linguistic norms of their hearer in order to emphasize the difference between themselves and the person or people they are talking to. So there is an aim, there is a purpose for linguistic divergence. So it is a process in which the speakers choose to move away but not to move to. It is not to make something similar but to move away from something. So to move away from the linguistic norms of their hearer in order to emphasize the difference between themselves and the process of people they are talking to. Let us have a very clear example. If somebody who is teaching Arabic and he always uses a classical Arabic, even at home, even in the street, and if he meets somebody whose language is not actually classical Arabic, it is just typical Arabic, everyday Arabic, a dialectical Arabic that is not similar to the type of language or dialect he is using. So if this person wants to show himself as different from that person, he will maintain his language. He will always use a classical Arabic so that he shows that this person is different from him. The language that he uses is different from the one the other person is using. So this is called language divergence, where two languages diverge from one another. They are not brought together, they are not similar to one another, they are not they are not in fact converging. In fact, they are moving away from one another. They are diverging rather than converging. So we have language convergence, where two languages come closer to one another, they are similar to one another. Language maintenance, when somebody or some speaker prefer not to change their language according to their speaker or hearer. And we have language divergence, where people move away from the norms, from standard Arabic, from standard English, so that one speaker looks different from the other. We move again to next point, which talks about power and linguistic imperialism, and this is the final point in chapter number 9. Language rights and recognition are often important issues in socio-political conflict all around the world. Let's have an example. Maintenance of a majority language within maintenance of a minority language within a majority culture, such as Spanish in the United States. So this is an issue of power. This is an issue of imperialism. If you are living in a United States and you are, for example, from Spain, it is clearly that your language, Spanish, is not the majority language. It is the language of a minor group of people, a little number of Spanish speakers. So the way that this has to do with power is that those Spanish speakers try to maintain their language, try to always use Spanish in spite of the fact it is not the official language, it is not the majority language. So it is an issue of power, where people maintain their minority language within a majority language. And the example we have is Spanish speaker or Spanish people in the United States, where they use Spanish in spite of the fact that the language used, or the main language or the majority language, is English. Because loss of language can also be associated with a loss of cultural identity. If you lose your language, you do not have cultural identity. If you lose your language, you actually do not have a social identity, because most of your experiences, most of your tradition has to do with your language, with the culture that you have came from. So losing your language means losing your cultural identity as well. Again, this has to do with power, and this has to do with your existence in that country where you are a minority group. Language can also be lost for a variety of reasons. We have two main reasons that people sometimes lose their language. They no longer use their language. Number one, speakers may choose to shift from one language to another. So if you are, for example, a native speaker of Arabic and you have moved to a European country where you start using and learning the language of that country, in fact you have choose to shift from one language to another as social condition change. So depending on your social condition, you have got a job, you have found a better way of living in say America, in the United Kingdom, and you have left your language, you're no longer using your language, and in fact this is one of the reasons that language can be lost for some people. So language can be lost because the speaker may choose to shift from one language to another. So you have shift from Arabic to English, for example. You have shift from Spanish to let's say English in the case of the Spanish minority moving to United States. The other reason is that one language may be imposed and another suppressed by a dominant power. So again, this is an issue of power. If you are a native speaker of Arabic and you are living in a European country, because everything is in English, because the government institution are using English as an official language, your Arabic is suppressed. One language, which is in our example is Arabic, is suppressed because you are not using it. It is not useful for you in that place because everybody is only accepting English. So one language may be imposed, which is English in this case, and another suppressed, which is Arabic in our example, by a dominant power. And the power that we mean here is the power of the government of that particular society, where the charter of that country would determine which language to use, which one is the official language, which one is officially recognized language, which one is used for communication, which one is used in the newspaper or on TV. So if there is a majority language and you are speaking a minority language, there is a very big chance that your language will be suppressed because it is no longer used in that country. And this is in fact one of the reasons that people lose their identity, lose their variety. We move to the second point in our study, which is the beginning of chapter 2. In this chapter we are going only to discuss one point. In the introduction, the author talks about the dialect known as Standard English and the specific status this dialect has, and we have certain point that we need to discuss related to this dialect, which distinguish the dialect of Standard English. Number one, Standard English is the dialect of an institution, is a dialect of governmental institutions such as government and law. So all those governmental institutions, universities, law and government buildings are all using language as the formal language, are using English as the formal language. So Standard English is the dialect of an institution. It is the language supported by the government. It is the language acknowledged by the government. It is recognized by the government. The government does not accept any other variety but Standard English. Standard English has this status. Number two is that Standard English is the dialect of literacy and education. The books in the universities are written in English, and they are taught in English. So it is the language of education. It is the language used in universities. It is the language used in schools. It is the language that people use to teach and to learn. So it is the language of education and literacy. So this is another characteristics of standard English. It is language supported by government, language of institution, language of laws, and it is the language of education and the language of literacy. Number 3, standard English is the dialect taught as English to foreign learners. So anybody who wants to learn English, he is not going to study Black English or non-standard English. In fact, what we study as English language in most of the courses all over the Arab world, for example, is standard English. Standard English is the language that is taught. We do not teach Black English. We do not teach a dialect. We do not teach a language that is reflecting a certain geographical area. It does not show that the speaker of this language belongs to a specific area in England or in the United States. It is the language that does not show any of these things. It is standard English. It is the language that is used in books, language of the government, language of governmental institution, and language of education. So when a foreigner or any person who wants to learn English, he is going to study standard English, but not any other type of English. Number 4, standard English is the dialect of the higher social classes. It is therefore the prestige form of English. So this also gives a standard English another feature. It is the language used by high social class people. It is the high class people, the language that is used by highly educated or people who are coming from a high social class, and therefore the norms, the structure of standard English are considered prestigious norms that are considered of a high class or coming from a high class on the social scale. We move to the point where we discuss the standard English debate, which is the beginning of chapter 1, and in the examples we have an example of non-standard English. This will give us a chance to understand how a standard English really differs from non-standard English. In non-standard English we have what's called multiple negation, and an example of this: I didn't know nothing. Well, this is not standard, this is not acceptable in standard English, but it is acceptable in non-standard English. So this is giving me an example of non-standard variety of English where multiple negation is available or is possible or is acceptable. Number 2, the use of ain't example, as in I ain't got none. So this is also an example of a language that is not standard. English people standard English speaker do not usually say I ain't got none. They say I didn't have any. So they do not use this structure of ain't. Ain't is a way of negating the verb to be instead of saying are not or is not or was not. So the use of ain't is an example of non-standard variety of English. So these are well-established English usage which do not happen to belong to the standard dialect. They belong to the non-standard dialect. The grammar of standard American and British English does not allow a sentence like I didn't know nothing because it contains multiple negation, and it also does not allow a sentence where we say I ain't got none because it is a language containing ain't, and we usually do not use those structures in standard English. Now we need to understand what is the definition of standard English. We need to understand how this dialect is characterized. What are the main characteristics of standard English? Number one, standard English is related to dialects, not to accents. So when I say it relates to dialect, it means it doesn't relate to pronunciation, but it relates to grammar. Standard English is difficult to isolate and put linguistic boundaries around. So we cannot say that only those sentences are standard English. There is no clear-cut distinction between standard and non-standard English, because some vocabularies are the same, some structures are the same. So standard English, non-standard English overlap. They can be similar to one another at one point. Standard English is the dialect of the middle and upper class. This is a clear characteristics of English, of standard English, that it is used by people who came from a middle or upper social class. Forms of standard English are socially prestigious. Everybody would acknowledge that speaking standard English is socially prestigious dialect. Before we finish this lecture, we have a definition of codification of standard English. What do we mean by codifying English as a standard dialect? It is a process where scholars analyze and record the vocabulary and the grammatical patterns of language. So we codify this language by collecting or by analyzing and recording the vocabulary and the grammatical patterns, the grammatical structures of a language. For English, as an example, much of this codification has already taken place in the 18th century, where the vocabulary and the grammar patterns or grammar structures that were collected, that were written at that time in dictionaries and grammar books, have become rules, and we nowadays refer to them as the rules of grammar of standard English. In fact, this brings us to the end of lecture number 12, where we finished only the first part of chapter 10. Thank you very much.